Loss, it's a word that carries with it a weight no one is ever fully prepared to bear. When the person we love, the one who is shared in our joys, sorrows, and everyday moments, is suddenly taken from us, the world becomes unrecognizable. For those who have lost a spouse, the pain is often immeasurable. The life that once felt whole, vibrant, and full of shared purpose can quickly become empty and silent. This video explores the intricate emotional landscape of grief, shedding light on personal stories, expert insights, and advice for those struggling to find their way through the darkness of loss. The depth of the void. When a partner, someone who has stood beside you through the trials and triumphs of life, is gone, the void left behind is profound. It's not just their physical presence that's missing, it's the intangible essence of the shared experiences, the laughter, the moments of silent understanding that only those who have spent decades together can know. Even with the support of children, close friends, and family, no one can fill the unique space left by the one who truly knew your soul. The absence becomes a sacred space, a reservoir of memories. Those moments of love and connection, once taken for granted, now feel like fragile relics that you cling to desperately. Grief often feels like an endless wave, washing over every corner of your existence. The weight of memories is both a comfort and a curse. In the depths of sorrow, moving forward can feel like an impossible betrayal of the love that once defined your life. But despite the intensity of the pain, there is also the possibility of healing, of learning to live in a way that honors the love shared, even after death. The heartbreaking journey of Mosley. A personal story of loss. Mosley, now 67, knows this pain all too well. Her story of love, loss, and the slow process of healing is one that many can relate to, but few can fully express. "When I was 64, she began, her voice trembling with the weight of her memories, "my husband passed away. We had been together for so long that I couldn't imagine life without him." Their relationship had spanned decades, years of companionship, shared dreams, and a love that had shaped both of their lives. At first, Mosley was in complete denial. "I would wake up every morning and for a brief moment, I would forget he was gone," she recalled. Then reality would hit, and the pain was unbearable. For a time, she felt like a walking corpse, just existing but not truly living. Every day felt like a blur of emptiness and despair, she admitted. Nights were the hardest. "I would lie in our bed now so wide and cold without him. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't stop the tears. I would stare at the ceiling, the empty pillow beside me, wondering why life felt so cruel." There were moments, Mosley confessed, when the weight of grief felt so overwhelming that she thought, "Why should I keep going? Maybe it would be easier to follow him." But then something shifted. As she looked at old photos, the ones where they were smiling, carefree, and happy, a spark of realization lit within her. "I could almost hear his voice gently reminding me, 'Don't do this to yourself. You deserve better. Live on for both of us.'" This moment of clarity became the anchor she needed to move forward. She realized that while her grief was deep, it would never bring him back. What she could do, however, was honor his memory by living a life that he would be proud of. The strength of the human spirit. Finding healing. After loss. Mosley's journey through grief is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. It is one of the most painful experiences we face, yet it holds the potential for profound growth. The separation between life and death may seem insurmountable, but with time, it is possible to transform that pain into something that reflects the love that still lingers in our hearts. As Mosley discovered, dwelling forever in sorrow only deepens the wound. The memories of the love you shared can be cherished, but they shouldn't hold you hostage. The present, with all its uncertainties and difficulties, still holds beauty and potential. The future, though unknown, offers the possibility of hope. Moving forward after the loss of a loved one doesn't mean forgetting them. It means choosing to carry their memory with you as you step into each new day. It's about finding a way to live because of the love that still resides within you, not in spite of it. Small steps toward healing. Practical strategies for coping. The path to healing is not an easy one, but it begins with small, deliberate steps. Mosley's advice to others who are grieving is both practical and deeply moving. "At first, I just tried to survive each day," she said. "I ate because I knew I had to, even when food felt tasteless. I went for walks in the park, even though my heart ached with every step." Slowly, she began to find moments of peace in the simple things: the cool breeze against her skin, the sound of birds chirping in the distance, the way sunlight filtered through the trees. These small, seemingly insignificant moments reminded her that life still had meaning, even if it was different from what it once was. Over time, she learned to embrace life after loss, a process that required courage and patience. "I used to hate being alone," she admitted, "but now I see it differently. Solitude is like aged wine. It's bitter at first, but it becomes rich and fulfilling when you give it time." Mosley learned to sit with her thoughts, reflecting on the good times without letting the grief overwhelm her. She even began to enjoy her own company in ways she never thought possible. Another critical part of Mosley's healing process was reconnecting with others. "Loneliness doesn't mean isolation," she said with a gentle smile. "I started reaching out to friends, even if it was just for a cup of tea or a quick chat. We would reminisce, laugh, and even cry together. It reminded me that I wasn't truly alone. Some people care, and sharing your feelings can lighten the load, even just a little." Ultimately, Mosley's story is a reminder that while the pain of losing a spouse or partner never truly goes away, it can be transformed into a quiet strength. "Living well is the greatest tribute I can give to my husband," she said. "I think of him every day, but instead of letting the sadness consume me, I let his memory inspire me." Embracing the later years, the power of connection and self-care. For anyone grieving the loss of a partner, Mosley's journey offers both comfort and guidance. It's okay to mourn, to cry, to feel lost for a time. Grief is a deeply personal experience, and everyone must find their own path through it. But as time passes, it's important to remember that grief shouldn't define you. It is not the entirety of your existence. There is still so much life left to live. Take care of your health, nourish your body and soul, Mosley advises. Find beauty in the small joys of life. Go for walks, savor a good meal, or simply sit in the sun and let its warmth remind you of the love that still surrounds you. And when loneliness inevitably creeps in, don't be afraid to reach out. Share your thoughts, your memories, and your dreams with those who care, she suggests. Even in solitude, there is a world of experiences waiting to be embraced. The later years of life, despite the inevitable loss, can still be filled with meaning, joy, and love. By choosing to move forward, not to forget, but to honor the memory of a loved one, it's possible to create a life that reflects the enduring power of love. It's a life that says, "I am here, I am living, and I carry your memory with me, always." Over-relying on children. The complexities of intergenerational support. In the wake of a spouse's death, many older individuals turn to their children for support, as they represent the closest bonds left. The loss of a partner often leaves an emotional void, and the children are seen as the natural source of care and comfort. The idea of living with one's children during retirement can seem like a comforting and practical arrangement, a way of ensuring that one is not alone during their later years. This belief is rooted in a lifetime of sacrifice and care. "I cared for you as a child. Now you'll care for me when I'm old." However, this well-meaning expectation can be fraught with complications. As society changes, so too does the structure of families. Today's younger generation faces mounting pressures that their parents never had to endure: rising costs of living, demanding careers, and the challenges of raising their own families. Many young people are stretched thin as they attempt to balance the needs of their children, their careers, and their aging parents. Asking them to focus entirely on the needs of their elderly parents can often lead to resentment, stress, and even conflict. The reality is that while the desire for support from children is understandable, this expectation can place an immense burden on them. The intergenerational gap in values, habits, and priorities can further strain the relationship, making it difficult for both sides to find harmony. Mrs. Howe's experience, a story of well-intentioned support gone awry. Mrs. Howe, a 65-year-old widow, offers a poignant example of this dilemma. When my husband passed away, it was as though my entire world crumbled, she recalled. We had always imagined growing old together, sitting on the porch, watching our grandchildren play, supporting each other through life's final chapter. But a cruel illness took him away too soon, leaving me utterly lost. In her grief, Mrs. Howe turned to her daughter for solace. At the time, my daughter had just given birth to my grandson. Her husband suggested I move in with them, and I was deeply touched by their kindness. I thought to myself, this is what family is for. Seeing my grandson every day brought me a sense of purpose, a reason to get out of bed. I began to pour all my energy into helping around the house, cleaning, cooking, and looking after the baby. Initially, the arrangement seemed to be working. Mrs. Howe was grateful for the opportunity to contribute and feel useful again. Her daughter and son-in-law expressed their appreciation by giving her a small allowance each month. But over time, things began to change. As her grandson grew older and more independent, her presence in the household became less essential. The financial support that had been offered dwindled, and Mrs. Howe felt a growing sense of invisibility. The very family who had once been her support system now seemed to be taking her for granted. The generational differences between her and her daughter's family began to create tension. Mrs. Howe felt like her needs were being overlooked, and she began to wonder if her children truly understood the sacrifices she had made for them throughout their lives. This complex emotional dynamic is something many older individuals face as they try to navigate the balance between independence and reliance on their children. The weight of loss. When we experience the death of a spouse, we're often left with a profound void, a space that once brimmed with shared dreams, mutual love, and years of history. For Mrs. Howe, this was the very reality she faced when her husband passed away. Their marriage had spanned decades, a testament to the resilience of their bond. Together they had faced life's challenges and built a life that was secure and full of love. But when he died, everything she had known to be stable crumbled beneath her. I couldn't breathe for weeks, Mrs. Howe confessed. It was as if my very soul had been ripped out of my body. I couldn't fathom a life without him. The pain was all-consuming, and yet she knew she had to survive. The first days and weeks after his death were a blur of grief and confusion. Her life had been so intricately woven into the fabric of their shared existence that the thought of moving forward felt both impossible and wrong. When your partner is no longer there, it's as if the world itself loses its color. The loneliness is thick, suffocating, and the silence left in the wake of their absence echoes in the deepest corners of your heart. I remember feeling like I was just floating through life, she added. I didn't know who I was anymore. I used to be his wife. Now, I was just Mrs. Howe, nothing more. Turning to family, a search for comfort. In the early days of her grief, Mrs. Howe leaned heavily on her daughter. With no other immediate family nearby, it felt natural to seek solace with her, to find a sense of purpose through caring for her daughter's new baby grandson. My daughter had just had my grandson. She and her husband were delighted, and they invited me to move in with them, Mrs. Howe recalled. I was so grateful. I thought, this is it. I can help and I can heal. It felt like the perfect solution. At first, the arrangement seemed to provide a sense of purpose for Mrs. Howe. There was comfort in being around family, the shared love for her grandson providing a small light in her otherwise dark world. She eagerly jumped into her new role, caring for the child, doing household chores, and helping in any way she could. The act of giving, of being useful, allowed her to feel needed once again, to feel like she was part of something. But the reality of living under the same roof as her daughter and son-in-law soon began to take its toll. Generational differences began to surface. Mrs. Howe had always been one to believe in discipline and structure, but her daughter and her son-in-law took a much more relaxed approach to parenting. I couldn't stand to see them let the child run wild. Mrs. Howe said. In my day, we believed in teaching children respect early on, but they seemed content to let him do whatever he wanted. The tension between her and her daughter grew, and though Mrs. Howe felt like her advice was coming from a place of love, her daughter began to take it as criticism. I just wanted to guide her, Mrs. Howe explained, but my words seemed to only push her away. I criticized the way she spent money, buying things online without saving for the future, and that made things worse. Unspoken tensions. The strain of living together. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the atmosphere in the house became increasingly strained. What was once a place of refuge and shared love began to feel like a battleground of unspoken resentment. Mrs. Howe would try to be helpful, cooking, cleaning, offering advice, but her efforts were no longer met with gratitude. Instead, they were seen as burdens. I tried so hard to fit in, Mrs. Howe reflected. I thought that by helping, by contributing, I could ease the pain I felt, but it seemed as though they were growing more distant from me. There was an unspoken feeling of being a guest in her own daughter's home, a feeling that perhaps she had overstayed her welcome. Despite Mrs. Howe's best efforts, her presence was becoming a source of tension. Her daughter and son-in-law, caught up in their own busy lives, no longer had the energy or patience to engage with her in the way they once did. They started speaking to me less kindly, she said. I could see it in their eyes. They were relieved when I wasn't around, but I didn't want to admit it to myself. It became clear to Mrs. Howe that what had started as an act of love, a way to fill the gap left by her husband, was becoming a prison of resentment and disconnection. She could no longer ignore the signs. She was no longer part of the family in the way she had hoped. She had become an outsider in her own home. The heart-wrenching decision, returning to her own home. Eventually, the tension reached a breaking point. With a heavy heart, Mrs. Howe made the difficult decision to leave. When I told them I was going to move out, I could see the relief in their eyes, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. It was as if they had been waiting for me to leave, but no one ever said it out loud. It was a crushing realization. She had invested so much into their household, sacrificing her own well-being for the sake of being needed. And yet, when it came time to leave, she was met with indifference. The place she had hoped to find comfort in had become a place of heartache, and now she was on her own once more. The process of returning to her own home was an adjustment fraught with loneliness. The first few weeks were unbearable, Mrs. Howe confessed. The house was so quiet. I would lie in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had made the right choice. It was like being abandoned all over again. In the solitude of her home, Mrs. Howe began to face the true weight of her grief. The silence, once a reminder of the absence of her husband, was now amplified by the absence of family. She missed the chaos of family life, even the disagreements. It was easier to endure the noise of others than to face the vast emptiness that surrounded her. Rediscovering herself, the journey to healing. But as time went on, Mrs. Howe began to rebuild. Slowly, she started finding small joys in the life she had left. I learned to embrace solitude, she said, her voice softer now. I began rediscovering things I had forgotten about, things that made me happy before life got so complicated. One of those things was painting. Mrs. Howe had always loved to paint, but had long since stopped when life became too busy. I found myself picking up the brushes again, and it felt so natural, so comforting, she smiled. It was as though the colors spoke to me in a way words never could. She also rediscovered her love for calligraphy and gardening, hobbies that she had put aside over the years. I started joining community groups for retirees, she said, and I met people who shared my interests. These people became my new family. They understood me in ways my own family never could. There was no judgment, no expectations. It was pure companionship. With each passing day, Mrs. Howe learned to cherish her independence. She began to enjoy the little things, the sound of birds chirping outside her window, the warmth of the sun on her face, the satisfaction of completing a new painting. It was as though, after all the pain, she had found a piece of herself that had been lost in the years of caregiving and raising a family. Looking back, Mrs. Howe didn't regret her decision to leave. "I've learned that relying too heavily on children for happiness only sets us up for disappointment," she said. "The greatest gift we can give ourselves is the ability to stand on our own, to find fulfillment within ourselves. The power of independence and self-fulfillment." Her journey wasn't just about learning to live alone, it was about learning to live with herself. Mrs. Howe now looks at her life differently. "I'm enough just as I am," she said, her face radiating a quiet strength. "I don't need anyone else to validate my worth. I have rediscovered my passions, my joys, and my strength, and I am living a life that is meaningful to me." Her story is a powerful reminder that family, while a source of love and support, should not be our sole anchor. The later years of life can still hold meaning and joy, but it requires courage, resilience, and a willingness to adapt. "I may have lost my husband, and my children may be busy with their own lives," Mrs. Howe said with a contented smile, "but I've found something even more precious myself.